takes away the power of the minority to block legislation. Actually, the talking filibuster doesn't do anything of the kind. It just says that when you block legislation, you have to do it in front of the American people. You have to stand here on the floor, and you have to make your case.
Senator Merkley, Mr. President, that's the essence of it. And as you know, what we have now is senators leaving. We actually had the case where a senator wanted the cloture vote to take place, but then left and went home. Pretty disgraceful situation. I heard that our good friend Senator Alexander is going to join us here in a little bit, and you, I know, were quoting from a speech. He recently gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation on January 4th, 2011. And one of the things that he said in there that I think we, all three of us, have echoed, Senator Harkin, Senator Merkley, Senator Alexander said, "Now there's no doubt that the Senate has been reduced to a shadow of itself as the world's greatest deliberative body, a place in which, as Senator Arlen Specter said in his farewell address, has been distinctive because of the ability of any senator to offer virtually any amendment any time." Senator Harkin, I know you have spoken passionately about the idea of offering amendments, how our democracy is deteriorated here in the Senate because it takes now 60 votes, every amendment. It didn't always used to be like that, did it? Senator Harkin, I would ask you, you've been here a while. What was the Senate 10, 15 years ago? Could you get an amendment through with a majority vote?
Well, if my friend would yield for a response, I would just say yes. Up until literally 4 or 5 years ago, you could offer an amendment on the floor, and if you got 51 votes, you won. And that happened for, well, I've been here, what, 25, 26 years, I guess now. And that's the way it's always been. Now, and sometimes there were tough amendments. Sometimes there were tough amendments by a Democrat. Sometimes there were tough amendments by a Republican. Didn't make any difference who was in the majority or minority. But, you know, I don't think people elected us just to have an easy time of it here and not to ever cast tough votes. Sometimes these are tough votes. But I think the senator from New Mexico is right. I mean, we always operate on the fact that a senator could offer an amendment. And usually you'd enter a time agreement. You'd say, how much time do you want? Well, you'd have an hour or an hour and a half or two or something like that. You'd have a reasonable time agreement. And you'd have a debate, and then you'd have a vote. And sometimes it'd be a tabling. People would move to table it, and that was fine. But at least 51 votes decided that. And now, as the senator pointed out, you got to have 60 votes for any amendment. Supermajority for any single amendment that you want to bring up in the Senate floor, you now have to have 60 votes. My friend, it wasn't always like that.
Senator Harkin, one of the things that happened to us right at the end of the Congress was we had a vote on a piece of legislation called the DREAM Act. And I believe the majority had 55 votes.
That's right.
For the DREAM Act. Now, here's a piece of legislation where we're talking about immigrant children who, through no fault of their own, probably brought in as tiny babies and grew up in the United States and have reached the age of adulthood and they have a ceiling on them. They can't go to college. They don't have Social Security numbers. And so we were basically trying to give them a dream that they could go out and be Americans. They could join the military, get in after they did their military service, get in line for citizenship. They could go to college and do well and get in line for citizenship. And in any other country, if you had the two legislative bodies, the House passed it by a majority, we passed it by a big majority, 55 votes, you'd have a law and the president would be signing it and it would be law today. And that's what's happened to this filibuster rule. And a lot of the steps we're taking don't necessarily get right to the heart of that, but I think the people understand that part of it. When I've gone home, people say, you know, what happened? What's going on? 55 senators voted for the DREAM Act, and it didn't get to become law. Senator Harkin?
Well, the senator would yield to you. It's absolutely right. I'll give the senator another example. As you know, the Supreme Court decided a case last year that allows certain entities to contribute money to political campaigns, and they don't even have to disclose who they are or how much they give. Supreme Court decision. Well, the House passed a bill, and the public opinion polls show that 80% of the American people were in favor of what we called the Disclose Act. We didn't say they couldn't give the money. We just said they ought to file, who are you? And how much money are you giving, and where are you getting that money from? Passed the House, came to the Senate. I believe we had 57 votes, if I'm not mistaken, for that. I could be corrected, but I think it was over 55 votes for that. But it didn't pass. Now, the average American out there would say, wait a minute, I thought if you got 51 votes, you won. No, no, no. Again, we had to have 60 votes in order to pass the Disclose Act. The President would have signed it into law. The House passed it. 80% of the American people were for it. But because there was this 60-vote threshold, we didn't get it passed. I see the senator from Oregon.
Well, Senator Harkin, I think that's a tremendous example. I believe we actually had 59 votes twice.
I stand corrected.
I believe. One vote short of the 60 needed to close debate on the motion to proceed to get to the Disclose Act. And so we couldn't even get on to the bill. So here is a bill, or here is a Supreme Court decision that allows unlimited, secret, foreign donations. Now, I'll tell you, as a red-blooded American, the idea of foreign companies secretly influencing American elections is outrageous. Mm-hmm. And we should have had a debate on that bill. But instead, we had 41 senators who said they wanted further debate, and then they weren't willing to stand up on the floor and make their case before the American people. And why did they want to hide from the American people? Because American people do not support secret foreign donations influencing American elections. That's why. Now, under the talking filibuster, folks couldn't have filed an objection and left this chamber and hid. They would have had to make their case. And the American people could have weighed in and said, you're a hero or you're a bum. In this case, I think that certainly most Americans, I believe, would have weighed in and said, get to that bill, get to a debate on it, and get it done, because it's the American tradition for Americans to make their decisions about who they elect, not foreign corporations to secretly spend money on American campaigns.
I think the senator, you pointed out correctly. I was mistaken. I thought it was 57. He said 59 votes. You'd think normally that bill would pass. Go to the President for his signature. Supported overwhelmingly by the American people. And yet thwarted because we have the right, as I said earlier, the minority in the Senate has the right of veto. They can veto whatever they want to bring up. What sense does that make in a democracy? I yield the floor. I thank the senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Harkin. And we see our good friend, Senator Alexander from Tennessee, has arrived, and we very much appreciate that. One of the things, Senator Alexander, we've been discussing here, and Senator Merkley had a chart and had the history of what had happened as far as rules debate. And you know, there's a lot of rules debate, 50s, 60s, 70s, and always the two leaders would allow a rules proposal to be on the floor. Be on the floor and be debated and be disposed of. And we now have a situation today where we can't get our rules proposals onto the floor. Senator Merkley is here with a talking filibuster proposal. I believe he's been talking with you. You've been Senator Alexander, you've been very open with us. It's saying, let's have discussions. And your theme has really been, like you say in your speech, at the heritage. The Senate needs to change its behavior, not change its rules. That's been your your function. But you're also working on rules changes with Senator Schumer, and we very much appreciate that. But I know Senator Harkin has a proposal, Senator Merkley has a proposal. I have Senate Resolution 10. You were here on the first day of the Senate on January 5th when we put in, with my two friends here, Senate Resolution 10, and we're trying to get it to the floor. And that's what I'm going to ask right now with my unanimous consent request, and we very much appreciate you being here. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 10, a resolution to improve the debate and consideration of legislative matters and nominations in the Senate, that there be 6 hours for debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees with no amendments in order, and that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote on adoption of the resolution.
Your objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I want to congratulate the senator from New Mexico. He has been persistent and diligent and enormously well-intentioned in this effort throughout the Rules Committee hearings and throughout the floor debate in seeking a way to help make the Senate function better, at the same time preserving the Senate as a forum for deliberation and protection of minority rights. We have a difference of opinion about whether that's best done by allowing changes of rules by 51 votes or by 67, which is the way the Senate rules currently prescribe. His proposal to change the rules certainly can be considered on the Senate floor in the regular order, and we would be happy to work with him to do that as long as it was by 67 votes. So because of that difference of opinion, I object.
Objection is heard. The Senator from Iowa.
Likewise, Senator from Tennessee knows that I have been on this for a long time, and I have a proposal also. And I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S.Res. 8, a resolution amending the standing rules of the Senate to provide for cloture to be invoked with less than a 3/5 majority after additional debate, that there be 4 hours for debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with no amendments in order, and that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote on adoption of the resolution.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Reserving the right to object, the senator from Iowa has, for at least since the early 90s, been forcefully arguing for his position. We have the same difference of opinion fundamentally that I mentioned in connection with Senator Udall's amendment. We're glad for these rules changes and amendments to come to the floor, but only if they're approved or rejected with a requirement of 67 votes. So for that reason, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, it has been the tradition of this chamber, when there are rules proposals, to put them on the floor for debate and to hold that debate, and then if the body does not like that, either to defeat them outright or to table them or refer them to committee for further work. And indeed, under the Constitution, it is in order for us to have a debate now as a simple majority to amend our rules. Now, the Constitution calls for a supermajority for impeachments, a supermajority for treaties, but it calls for a simple majority to amend our rules and to organize ourselves. And so many members of this body often talk about the Constitution. And it's the Constitution that we're talking about right now, when it calls for a simple majority to be able to organize. So that is why, in 1953, the Senate debated Senator Anderson's resolution, eventually defeating it by tabling it. That is why in 1957 and in 1959, they proceeded to put on the floor, both sides agreeing that it was appropriate under the Constitution to have the debate in this chamber and then to either approve or to vote down or to table or to refer to committee. And then in 1961, Anderson's rule proposal to make cloture 3/5 precedent in voting was referred to committee, so it was defeated again. But it was debated and referred to committee. And then the committee returned it to the floor for further debate. No one objected to us holding a debate. In fact, here is the irony. We're talking about fixing the broken Senate because debate is unable to take place, and this very conversation we are having right now with proposals to be put on the floor is being objected to by the other side because they're saying that it's not appropriate. But the Constitution says it's appropriate. The tradition of the Senate says it's appropriate. And so I, too, have a resolution to put on the floor, a proposal for debate. It is the talking filibuster proposal, and it is important that senators not be able to object to regular order of 51 and then go home or go on vacation and hide from the American people. But if they believe there should be additional debate, that they come to this floor and debate. The people of America believe that that's what the filibuster is about, making your case before the American people. Let's make it so. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 21, a resolution to amend Rule 19 and Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate to enact these with no amendments in order, and that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote on adoption of the resolution.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving
Senator
the
from Tennessee.
right to object. The senator from Oregon is a former speaker of his House in Oregon. He's been a long observer of the United States Senate, having come here first working for Senator Hatfield, and has been effective and passionate in his views. I was reviewing today some remarks made by largely Democratic senators 4 or 5 years ago when some Republicans got the idea that it might be a good idea to reduce to make this a more majoritarian body, and Senator Schumer, Senator Reid, Senator Clinton, Senator Obama all said it would be a mistake. So although I greatly respect the senator from Oregon, we have a difference of opinion about whether it's in the best interest of the Senate and of the country to change the rules in this way, so I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oregon.
I thank my colleague from Tennessee for coming to the floor and applaud his long service. When I first came to the U.S. Senate, Senator Hatfield asked me to bring greetings to his former colleagues, and I had a chance to sit down with Senator Alexander and convey those greetings and to work with him on some projects, including the advocacy for electric vehicles. Good for the American economy, good for the strategic positioning of America in terms of its consumption of energy, and certainly good for the environment. And I just want to note that while we disagree on this, this is actually the way it should happen, that we should come to the floor and share our respective views, disagree with each other, make our points. I believe that at this moment we should be on a rule. We should be debating it. My colleague has expressed his difference of opinion in a very gracious and respectful manner, and that, too, should be a factor of Senate dialogue, so I thank him. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
senators will gather here in the Senate chamber, then proceed over to the House chamber for President Obama's State of the Union speech tonight. We'll have that live here on C-SPAN 2 when it happens. A bit of history from the Associated Press. At the same point in his presidency 28 years ago, Ronald Reagan was saddled with an approval rating much lower than President Obama's is now, and the unemployment rate was then a full percentage point higher. For President Reagan, the economy recovered quickly and strongly, carrying him to re-election in 1984. And Associated Press continues to write that it's possible President Obama could benefit from an equally robust economic revival before Election Day in 2012, but expectations are lower this time because the government has already used up most of its tools to boost the economy. Again, that's from the Associated Press. Watch our State of the Union coverage on C-SPAN starting at 8 Eastern and here on C-SPAN 2 at 9. Senators are preparing to hear from President Obama tonight in his State of the Union address. Attending will be John and Roxana Green, the parents of the late Christina Taylor. That's the 9-year-old girl who was killed in the Tucson shooting. Also there tonight, Daniel Hernandez, a Representative Gifford's intern who helped her clear the wounded Congresswoman's airway and held her until medics arrived. Some of our coverage tonight, C-SPAN will have interviews and the speech starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and then your phone calls after the speech. Again, that's on C-SPAN. And here on C-SPAN 2, the speech at 9, and we'll show you the tweets from representatives during President Obama's speech. After that, we get immediate reaction from members of Congress in Statuary Hall. senators and representatives will meet in joint session tonight to hear from President Obama in his State of the Union speech. That'll happen in the House chamber. Tonight, President Obama, according to reports from the Washington Post and other places, will call for reducing the deficit, also propose a 5-year freeze on non-defense government spending. And Washington Post writing that facing a Republican House for the first time, the president has a chance to reset his relationship with his political foes, inviting a level of bipartisanship at the midway mark in his term. At C-SPAN, we're going to have an historical look at bipartisanship between past presidents and Congress, also a discussion on the bipartisan seating plan for this year's address. That's on C-SPAN starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight.
Consent to vitiate the quorum call?
Without objection.
Mr. President, I submit Resolution 24 on behalf of myself and Senator Tom Udall, proposing a standing order of the Senate, and I ask unanimous consent of the Senate that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of the resolution.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, for purposes of having the resolution go over under the rule, I object.
Objection is heard, and the resolution will go over under the rule.
Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
A number of things will be different for President Obama during his State of the Union tonight. Sitting behind the President in the House chamber, the new Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner. Also, a new Congress with a Republican majority. And there'll be a different seating arrangement. Democrats and Republicans will sit elbow to elbow rather than next to each other, rather than the traditional arrangement with Republicans to the President's left and Democrats to his right. Associated Press also writing that many in both parties will be wearing black and white lapel pins, signifying the deaths of the Tucson victims and the hopes of the survivors. You can see our coverage on C-SPAN starting at 8 Eastern and here on C-SPAN 2 at 9. We're going to have coverage of President Obama's speech tonight here on C-SPAN 2 that's a little different. You'll be able to read tweets from members of Congress while watching the President give the State of the Union address. Then after that, we'll have reaction from lawmakers in Statuary Hall. All that starts at 9 Eastern. A headline in Politico says, what President Obama needs to do tonight. One of the things they write, find the sweet spot on jobs and deficits. As presidential high-wire acts go, it doesn't get any more high stakes than this. President Obama squeezed between a 9.4% unemployment rate and a national debt estimate at $14 trillion. He'll chart a middle course, offering up a slate of new